In our headlines on this Monday afternoon, May 8th, here in South Korea. President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida agreed to have a South Korean team of experts inspect Tokyo's planned discharge of radioactive wastewater from the crippled Fukushima nuclear power plant. And while avoiding a direct apology to Korean victims of Japan's past colonial rule, Prime Minister Kishida acknowledges their sufferings during the difficult times, saying that his heart aches. Meanwhile, Seoul's Economy and Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho says work is underway to establish a leading semiconductor alliance with the US to address supply chain vulnerabilities and advance critical technologies. President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida have reaffirmed their resolve to reconcile their two nations to allow for a future of greater gains for their people. Now, intentions to this end were shared during Sunday's press conference after their summit at the Yongsan Presidential Office. Our senior top office correspondent Oh Soo-young starts us off.
Seeking emotional reconciliation, South Korea and Japan are taking their next steps to overcome sensitive sticking points as the neighbours mend fences in the face of various geopolitical and economic challenges. At a joint press conference following their summit in Seoul, President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida on Sunday announced key measures to build trust and value-based cooperation.
우리 두 정상은 한일 관계 개선이 양국 국민에게 큰 이익으로 돌아온다는 점을 확인하고 앞으로도 더 높은 차원으로 양국 관계를 발전시켜 나아가는 데 합의했습니다.
Building on their March summit in Tokyo, Yoon and Kishida reaffirmed their commitment to strengthening trilateral cooperation with Washington against growing nuclear and missile threats from North Korea. They acknowledged their ongoing efforts to bolster security cooperation, including information sharing on North Korean missiles. The leaders also recognized joint efforts to launch a new economic security dialogue, youth exchange funding and new cultural exchanges. Lauding the progress they made in just 2 months, they pledged to expand programs and scholarships for the future generation, as well as the number of flights between the two countries. The two then touched upon sensitive matters. Yoon and Kishida agreed on the South Korean inspection into the safety of the radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plant, separate from the ongoing probe under the International Atomic Energy Agency. This comes amid the South Korean public's concern over Japan's plan to release the treated wastewater into the ocean. Japanese media have reported that a Korean inspection team will head to Fukushima on May 23rd. In another move to grow their value-based relationship, the two leaders also plan to visit a memorial park in Hiroshima this month to honor Korean victims of the atomic bomb in 1945, when Yoon attends the G7 summit there later this month upon Kishida's invitation. Both leaders said they looked forward to deepening their cooperation on broader global issues at the G7 meeting.
If you look at the developments in the international community, our bilateral cooperation is essential. At the G7 Hiroshima summit, we will hold a Japan-South Korea-US summit and further deepen our discussions.
Marking the first time in 12 years that a Japanese leader has visited Seoul for a summit, Kishida's 2-day trip has put the so-called shuttle diplomacy in full swing, reciprocating Yoon's visit to Tokyo in March.
It seems there is more shuttling to come as the South Korean president heads to Hiroshima in less than 2 weeks, where he is also expected to hold a 3-way summit with Kishida and Joe Biden. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
And during his address to members of the media here in Seoul, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida shared sorrow with regard to the past sufferings of Koreans in forced labor during Japan's colonial rule. Our foreign affairs correspondent Peun covers his remarks.
Unsurprisingly, the message that Japan's Prime Minister Kishida gave on forced labor victims was not that much different from the one he gave when he met President Yoon in March, as he still avoided using the word apology. But for the first time, he did say that he felt heartbroken for those who had to work in difficult conditions, apparently referring to the Korean victims of wartime forced labor.
As I said when President Yoon visited Tokyo in March, our government's stance remains and will continue to remain that we uphold the historical recognition made by previous cabinets, including the joint declaration made in October 1998. My heart aches for those who had to work under difficult conditions at the time.
Japan has been saying that it would continue to, quote, uphold the stance on previous cabinets, including the joint declaration between former leaders of the two countries, made in 1998, without using the word apology. The joint statement between former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and former Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi includes Tokyo's deep remorse and heartfelt apology for causing tremendous damage and suffering to Koreans during its colonial rule. In response to Kishida's latest remarks, a senior official from Seoul's presidential office noted that President Yoon expressed gratitude and said he hopes this will enhance cooperation between the two countries. While meeting Kishida on Sunday, he stressed that it's important to let go of the past and move forward.
양국이 과거사가 완전히 정리되지 않으면 미래 협력을 위해 한 발자국도 내디딜 수 없다는 인식에서는 벗어나야 한다고 생각합니다.
Since President Yoon took office in May last year, his administration has been pushing to mend ties with Japan. Seeking to improve relations, the South Korean government in March laid out plans to solve the long-standing dispute over compensation for people subjected to forced labor by Japan, through funds secured by Korean companies instead of the accused Japanese firms. The victims and supporting civic groups protested, saying this issue cannot be resolved without sincere apologies and participation by the Japanese companies that are responsible. But President Yoon on Sunday reiterated that the government is not willing to change its plan on this issue. 배은지, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, prior to his departure from Seoul on this Monday, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida sat down with 6 leaders of Korean business entities, including the Korean Chamber of Commerce. Their talks underscored the importance of active collaboration between Korea's chip makers and Japan's materials, parts, and equipment providers. They also touched upon boosting cooperation in the fields of energy and EV batteries. However, specific measures have yet to be addressed. The Biden administration has welcomed the latest summit between its key allies here in this part of the world, and their ongoing efforts to enhance bilateral ties have made American headlines as well. My colleague Han Sung-woo files this report.
Welcoming their summit, the U.S. State Department has commended South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida for their leadership. Spokesperson Matthew Miller posted on Twitter that the U.S. will continue working with its allies and partners to advance a free, open, prosperous, secure, and resilient Indo-Pacific. Major U.S. media outlets have described Yoon and Kishida's summit as the two nations' resumption of shuttle diplomacy after 12 years, amid increasing regional security threats posed by North Korea and China. However, they also shed light on the fact that the Japanese leader did not meet expectations from many South Koreans that he would offer an official apology on Japan's imperial past and the wartime forced labor of Koreans. The New York Times reported that Kishida upheld some of his predecessors' expressions of remorse and apologies, but, quote, went no further than that, merely saying that his heart ached at the suffering Koreans endured. The newspaper also observed that leading up to the summit, few analysts believed that decades-long tensions would disappear easily due to political pressure at home for both Yoon and Kishida. Citing South Korea's former ambassador to Japan, Shin Gak-soo, the Washington Post acknowledged that Kishida's direct reference to the brutal conditions of life for Koreans under colonial rule was an important gesture that signaled Kishida's understanding of the stakes of his comments. But it added that there's still a long road ahead, saying that rapprochement is still a delicate and politically fraught effort. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
Economy and Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho says efforts are underway to lay the groundwork for a world-class chip alliance with the U.S. in line with summit talks over in Washington, D.C. in late April. Our correspondent Lee Dae-yeon has more on his remarks.
South Korea is aiming for stronger ties with the United States in the semiconductor sector. Measures to follow up President Yoon Suk-yeol's visit to Washington last month were discussed during a ministerial meeting on Monday presided over by Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho. Chu highlighted the chip industry, saying that Seoul and Washington will lay out the foundations of the bilateral chip alliance based on cooperative projects on next-generation chips, high-tech packaging, and chip material, parts, and equipment. Chip forums between the public and private sectors will also be set up. In terms of the U.S. CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, he mentioned that the two countries are working to reduce the burden and uncertainties faced by South Korean businesses as a consequence of both acts. The finance minister said close consultation on the matter will continue so that it can eventually become a win-win for both Seoul and Washington. Chu also pledged to strengthen ties in advanced technology industries.
We will develop cooperation in the chip, battery, bio, quantum, and digital sectors by establishing a next-generation critical and emerging technologies dialogue led by national security advisors in the second half of this year.
The minister added domestic clusters related to these industries will be further developed, and he will actively engage in putting to work the $5.9 billion of investments secured by President Yoon during his trip to the U.S. The Finance Ministry also revealed plans to focus on overseas construction projects, factories, nuclear power plants, and eco-friendly businesses in order to reach its target of $35 billion in overseas orders this year. He said he will once again ramp up government-to-government cooperation to win contracts on mega projects such as Saudi's Neom City and the construction of Indonesia's new capital city. To do this, he will provide diplomatic and financial support for these large-scale plant projects in the Middle East while expanding eco-friendly businesses related to green hydrogen and cutting greenhouse gases. Lee Dae-yeon, Arirang News.
Staying on the local front, a rebound in domestic consumption appears to be keeping the local economy afloat in the face of retreating exports. According to the Korea Development Institute on this Monday, car sales rose 14.5% on-year in March, while travel sales jumped 18.2%. In sharp contrast, the value of exports plunged over 14% on-year in April. Officials at the institute linked the plunge to sluggish demand for semiconductors in the global market, with their production falling by almost 27% on-year. Seoul's Ministry of SMEs and Startups plans to create several innovative tech clusters across the country. A total of 10 global innovation zones will be set up by the year 2027 for small and mid-sized firms in the high-tech sector. Within these zones, companies will be permitted to partake in diverse and emerging technology, with the exception of those restricted. The latest initiative follows the Korea-US Cluster Roundtable that was held during President Yoon Suk-yeol's state visit to the US in late April. 2 or 3 zones will be launched this year in collaboration with universities, research centers, and global companies. Also, on the local front, overall inflation eased to 3.7% in April, but the public is seeing no relief with regard to dining and grocery bills, which have soared in recent times. Our Kim Hyun-sung reports.
Inflation has slowed recently, but food prices are still climbing, putting a strain on consumers' wallets. According to Statistics Korea on Monday, the inflation rate for consumer prices dropped to 3.7% last month, falling below 4% for the first time in more than a year. But the cost of dining out has increased by a massive 7.6% in April, compared to a year earlier. That's more than double the overall rate, putting the gap between the inflation of dining out costs and the average inflation rate at its widest level in 31 years. Processed foods also saw a high inflation rate of almost 8%. Nearly 30% of food items saw an inflation rate of above 10% last month. Prices for jams and dressings have skyrocketed by more than 30%, while some food items such as cheese, pasta noodles, and fish cakes have seen price increases of more than 20% from the previous year. These price hikes for essential goods and services are hitting the wallets of consumers who are already struggling in a tough economic climate. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, in Peru, at least 27 people have been killed by a fire in a gold mine. Local reports say the fire broke out on Saturday in a tunnel inside a gold mine in the southern Arequipa region. According to the BBC, 175 miners were rescued. Local government officials believe an electrical short circuit may have caused the fire. Peru is one of the world's largest gold producers, accounting for some 4% of the world's annual gold supply. While the loss of lives in the country's mining industry is not unusual, pundits point out the latest tragedy is Peru's worst single disaster since the year 2000. And over in the UK, data shows fewer people tuned in to watch the coronation of King Charles III as compared to those who turned to the screens to watch Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. Our Lee Seung-jae has details.
You might expect a historic event like the coronation of King Charles III to be a huge draw for people in the UK tuning in on TV. But how many switched on to watch? According to audience measurement group Barb on Sunday, the King's coronation was watched by an average of 18.8 million viewers across 11 channels and services. With the broadcast of the ceremony itself taking place from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. local time, viewership peaked just after midday, with 20.4 million viewers when King Charles III was officially crowned. With visible anti-monarchy protests coinciding with the ceremony, it appears public sentiment toward the royal family is changing. King Charles III's coronation was watched by significantly fewer people than Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, which garnered some 26.5 million viewers. Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953 is believed to have been watched by millions, but no reliable figures are available. Although surveys by BBC at the time estimated that over 20 million people had watched the event. Also, some British channels even opted to not air the event. For instance, Channel 4 decided to show Johnny English Strikes Again with an average of 138,000 people preferring to watch the film rather than the coronation. Channel 5 meanwhile decided to entertain kids with The Adventures of Paddington Bear and SpongeBob SquarePants. Still, many across the UK celebrated King Charles III's coronation with a so-called big lunch, which brought neighbors and communities together to share friendship, food, and fun. In fact, 50,000 venues held such an event, with UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak hosting a big lunch at 10 Downing Street. US First Lady Joe Biden, along with her granddaughter, attended the event hosted by the Prime Minister, with Ukrainian refugees, youth group members, and community volunteers also invited. A coronation concert was also held at 8 p.m. on the East Lawn of Windsor Castle, with names like Take That, Katy Perry, Lionel Richie, and Andrea Bocelli performing. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In Ukraine, Russia's Wagner group has said it would keep fighting to capture the city of Bakhmut. The group had previously said it would pull out of the city, but appears to have changed its decision. This according to a new audio message by the head of the paramilitary organization, Yevgeny Prigozhin. In it, he said Russia's military leadership promised Wagner on Sunday that it would send as many weapons as needed to capture the city in eastern Ukraine. The audio clip comes a day after Prigozhin claimed in another message that his forces have captured 95% of Bakhmut. Prigozhin criticized the Russian military's top brass in a video message on Friday. Standing in front of dozens of dead soldiers, he said that tens of thousands of Russian troop casualties were due to a lack of ammunition support from Moscow, and threatened to pull his forces from the region by May 10th. Syria has been readmitted into the Arab League 12 years after its membership was revoked. At the organization's headquarters in Cairo on Sunday local time, foreign ministers voted for Syria's return to the body. Syria was thrown out in 2011 after its brutal suppression of protests against President Bashar al-Assad, which led to an ongoing civil war and a refugee and drug smuggling crisis. The reinstatement has been criticized by the US and the UK. But the Arab League has defended its move, saying that it aims to end Syria's civil war using a special committee. Consisting of 22 member states, the goal of the Arab League is to integrate members economically and solve conflicts among members without foreign assistance. Moving over to the U.S. state of Texas, a driver has been arrested after an SUV plowed into a crowd of people, killing 7. The incident occurred near the border town of Brownsville on Sunday local time. Video from the scene shows the driver ran through a traffic light and struck the crowd waiting at a bus stop outside a migrant shelter. Some pedestrians walking by were also hit. Reports say 10 others were wounded. Most of the victims were Venezuelan men waiting outside the shelter. The driver was apprehended by witnesses while attempting to flee and is now in police custody. Authorities are investigating whether the crash was done intentionally. And finally, more than 200,000 athletes around the world took part in one of the world's largest charity runs on Sunday. Called the Wings for Life World Run, it was the 10th edition of the event, with all proceeds being donated to spinal cord research. Participants in 158 different countries all started simultaneously at 11 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Runners had no finish line but had to compete with a virtual catcher car that started chasing runners 30 minutes after the start signal. The furthest distance achieved by a male runner before being caught was by Japan's Joe Fukuda, who won the event for the second time, running a total of 69.01 kilometers. The furthest distance by a female runner was 55.07 kilometers by Kasia Szkoda of Poland. The run raised almost $6.4 million for charity. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. After some rough weather we had over the Children's Day weekend under murky skies, heavy rain with strong winds, we are having a pleasant Parents' Day weather today. Breezy morning temperatures are jumping to the 20s with sunshine all day long. In fact, sunlight might be too strong during the day. Sunblock and sunglasses are a must to protect yourself from the nasty UV rays. Not much to complain about weather-wise today, with even air quality forecast to be good to normal nationwide all day. Daily highs in most parts are 3 to 7 degrees higher than yesterday, hovering above 20 degrees Celsius this afternoon. And if you need to, you should go for a car wash today. The weather outlook for this week looks good and promising with the sunshine. Top temperatures will be staying slightly above season norms. Just be aware of big temperature differences between lows and highs and do dress accordingly. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And those are the headlines at this hour. Thank you for watching, but do stay tuned for our panel session coming up next. See you soon.